So welcome to the third and the last day of the Incorporate Sustainability Conference. It has been a productive 2 days up until now, and I'm very, very much looking forward to the discussions of today because they're very relevant. The sustainability transition can rarely be carried out without the correct financing, where we're encountering challenges, but also opportunities. So I want to start on an optimistic note that much has been done in the field and more is left to be done. I am extremely excited to say that we're opening the day with an excellent keynote by Professor Dr. Alex Edmans. I believe that every single one of them knows him, but I will still present him for those who kind of missed it. He's a professor of finance at London Business School. He has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright scholar, he is a previously tenured professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Alex has also spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, and gave the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, and the TEDx Talk, The Social Responsibility of Business, with a combined 2.4 million views. He serves as a Mercer School Memorial Professor of Business at Gieschen College, giving a 4-year program of lectures to the public and on Royal London Asset Management's Responsible Investment Advisory Committee. His book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, was featured in the Financial Times list of business books of the year for 2020. He has been named to the Poets and Quant's Best 40 Professors Under 40 and Thinkers 50 radar. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Alex among us today. Thank you for accepting the invitation, and I think he has a tiny surprise for every single one of you that I won't mention, and I will leave it to him. So, Alex, the floor is all yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Leila. It's great to be here, and thank you to everybody for joining. It's a huge pleasure to open this day. So what I'm going to talk about is the business case for responsibility. So there's clearly a moral case and an ethical case, and the moral and ethical case are really important. But I think without a clear business case, responsibility will always be secondary to any CEO and CFO. In particular, you might think, yes, we can be responsible in good times when companies are flush with cash, but in a crisis or when your back's to the wall, is this something that you want to invest in? So I come to this, as Leila said, as a finance professor, not a professor of ethics or philosophy, and also as an ex-investment banker, but even a hard-hearted person like me can actually believe in responsibility because not only does it create value for wider society, it can also create value for shareholders alike. And I think a good place to start is just by giving an example of what I mean by a purposeful business. You might think, well, don't we already know this? That's why we're all here. But I might actually have a quite different view of responsibility to what you might think. And to explain my different view, let me start with a story. I'm going to speak for about half an hour, so there will be a lot of time at the end, 15 minutes for questions. So I'd like to take you a little bit on a journey outside your home offices to halfway around the world. I want to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before. But in fact, some of you might have seen it before, not on the small screen of your home laptop, but maybe on the big screen of a movie theatre. It was featured in The Constant Gardener, a blockbuster that came out about 15 years ago. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. So for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold a goat, he would receive cash, but he'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash, but worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, it just wasn't just walking down to the nearest bank. He had to trek for an entire day to get to one. So his life was really tough, right? He couldn't graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of a bank. But all of this changed due to what I would call a responsible business. And that business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. So Vodafone in 2007, as some of you might know, launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. So what is mobile money? Right, some of us think it's mobile banking. Right, I have a bank account and I can choose to operate it on my phone rather than having to go to the branch. But actually mobile money is even more powerful, right? Because with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really important because at the time, 50 million Kenyans had no access to the banking system. So this completely transformed Emmanuel's life. Right, he no longer needs to deal with cash. He doesn't need to worry about robbery or forgery. And he can graze his goats where he wants to. He doesn't need to be within one day of a bank. And as a finance professor, while I believe in the power of large-scale data, not just one anecdote, and indeed a study which came out of MIT found that within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households are headed up by women because they allow them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a big effect on gender parity. Now that's one story I'm going to give you about Vodafone. But now let me give you a second story. And this second story surrounds tax. So in 2012, Vodafone released a tax transparency report showing how much tax they're paying to governments around the world. And that's really important because in telecoms, you could choose to dodge tax by locating your intellectual property in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got 2 questions for everybody here to think about. First is which of these decisions, tax transparency or launching M-Pesa, created most value for society? The second is which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public anger or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here. There will be enough time for questions at the end, because most people I speak to agree with the answer. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and also contributed to gender parity. But let me now turn to the second question. What would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. Well, you don't get slammed by the media for not launching an innovation. There would have never been a customer boycott had Vodafone not thought about this great idea of coming up with banking without a bank. Why? Because no customer would have ever even thought this was possible to begin with. But what is the outrage of not being transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores 2 years previously because of concerns they weren't paying enough tax. So this is why my view of responsibility and purpose might differ from many of the other views that you would have heard. Often people think about responsibility as being the answer to the second question. Businesses should do no harm. Like they should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. They should not price gouge customers. And often, like finance people like me, think about responsibility as being about risk management. We don't want a company that gets into a scandal. Now, please don't get me wrong. Absolutely, it's important for a business to do no harm. Absolutely, we don't want our businesses to get caught up in scandals. But I'm saying that that is not enough. But in 2021, it is not enough for a business just to not cheat on taxes and not harm its workers. It must actively do good and answer that first question. So why is that? Well, go back to the start of my talk. There's the moral case and there's the business case. So the moral case is that, well, in 2021, given the scale of the world's challenges, climate change, automation, the coronavirus, it's not enough for a company just to say, I'm not doing any scandals. You must actively do good and try to solve those problems. But the second is the financial case, moving from just avoiding scandals to actively creating value is financially profitable in the long term. And so this is the framework that I introduced in the recent book that Layla mentioned. We often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And we can split that pie either to investors in the form of profits or society in the form of value, that's the orange, and that might be taxes to the government, fair wages to employees, and fair prices to customers. And often we think that responsibility is about splitting the pie more fairly, so sacrificing profits in order to create more value for society. Maybe we're going to give more to charity or pay our workers more. And again, don't get me wrong, fairness and equality is important, but that is not all what responsibility is about, for at least two reasons. Right, the first is if responsibility is about splitting the pie differently, then many CEOs might not do this. Why? Because it just reduces their profits. And indeed, we saw 2 years ago, many CEOs signed the Business Roundtable statement claiming they're going to serve wider society. But many of them did not put it into practice. And why would they? If purpose means you're going to be less profitable, then just don't do it. Sign a nice statement, but never take any action. The second reason why purpose can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, I don't care. Right, they like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then everybody's going to be better off. But I don't need to tell this audience that investors are not them, they are us, right? They include pension funds saving for retirement, parents saving for their children's education. So any repurposing of business needs to take profit seriously. Profits do play an important role in a well-functioning society. So this is why my view of purpose is that it's about growing the pie. Right, we absolutely do want to increase the orange, but the way we do that is not by giving people a greater slice of what's already there, but by actively creating value, coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank, like Vodafone. And the beauty of that is that even though you do this not to make money, you do this to create value for society, to solve a social problem of financial inclusion, ultimately, you might be able to monetize it and therefore make more profit and make investors better off. Like whenever you create value by growing the pie, there's more to share, and therefore you can be benefiting both shareholders and society. Now, a skeptic might argue, well, isn't this just good business? Right? Shouldn't any company, even one that only cares about profits, want to create value and innovate? Look at this statement. It will be in the long run interest of a company to improve its government or to provide amenities for that community. This will make it easier to attract employees. Who do you think wrote this? Not Larry Fink, in fact, Milton Friedman. So arguably the enemy of sustainable business wrote 50 years ago that actually companies should care about society because that is the way to increase profits. But why I disagree with him is Milton Friedman had an instrumental approach to profit maximization. He said when a company decides whether or not to take an investment, you should do a calculation. Right? If I build a factory, how many toys can that factory make? How much can I sell those toys for? And is that enough to compensate for the cost of the factory? Now that works for factories, but many of the things that we are thinking about when we think about responsibility, you cannot measure and you cannot predict it like a factory. So let's say I'm going to choose to give my employees more parental leave. How much more money will that create? How more productive will they be? I can't put a number on this. And let's go back to Vodafone launching M-Pesa. You could never justify that on financial grounds, right? At the time, Vodafone's strategy was to expand in the West and to win spectrum license auctions. However, right, they would never want to do something like launch something in Kenya because there's no money there compared to in the West. But the power of purpose was that it opened Vodafone's eyes to another opportunity, which ended up being profitable in the long term, but you would have never gone down that route at the outset had you not been driven by purpose, because it would be much easier just to focus on the West, where you had a clearly defined market. Okay, so I'm about 12 minutes into my talk, and so far you might think, well, everything I've said for the past 12 minutes sounds fantastic, but where is the evidence, right? It seems a bit like wishful thinking. I'm telling you, companies should serve wider society, and magically, some profits will appear. But that sounds almost too good to be true. So this is what my role is as a business school professor, is to look at the large-scale evidence to see whether this is actually borne out in the data. And it's really important to be critical with the evidence, right? Because of this problem called confirmation bias, right? People are very willing to accept evidence if they believe they would like it to be true. And because everybody wants to believe that purposeful companies do better, even if there's really flimsy evidence showing this, people will latch onto this. And this was indeed the topic of my TED talk that Layla mentioned earlier, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, is how careful we must be about evidence when it's something we feel strongly about. And let's give you a recent example. So about 6 months ago, my LinkedIn feed was filled with the following, and maybe some of yours was as well. Right, there was this new study apparently proving that sustainability always pays off. Right, this is one of the leading investors in the UK who asked, is there anyone left on the planet who thinks that sustainable investing requires a sacrifice of return? And then people were just falling over themselves to say how good this study was. It was rigorous, it was infallible facts, it was robust proof. But they just got excited about it because it showed what they wanted to show. Anybody looking at the data would see how weak it was. And then a few months later, there was some argument on the opposite side. Another paper came out claiming there's no evidence that ESG outperforms. And then similarly, the opponents of ESG said, oh, this must be absolutely true. It's got all of the evidence is here. This must be a ruse and so on. But then I went to the financial firms myself. I said, well, no, reality is somewhere in the middle. Like, we must avoid black and white thinking where we latch onto whatever study supports our view of the world, and instead look at studies based on their scientific rigor. And so that's what I'm going to do for the next few minutes, is to look at the evidence in an objective and dispassionate way. And spoiler alert, like, some things will pay off, but other things won't. And so we must take a discerning approach to ESG. So let me start in the corner of the ESG movement. Where is the strongest evidence that purpose might pay off? And I'm going to refer to one of my own studies, and this is indeed why I got interested in ESG about 15 years ago. So I wanted to look at, are companies that are purposeful actually going to deliver more value in the long term? And the big question is, how do we measure purpose, right? We could look at a company's purpose statement, but as we know, companies might say some nice things, but never put them into practice. So you might think, well, why don't I look at what they actually do, right? Do they put their money where their mouth is? How much money do they give to charity? How much money do they pay to their workers? But that looks at the input, not the output. Maybe you're giving loads of money to charity, but you're not supporting the best charities. Right? Any sports fan will know that you could spend tons of money on players, but not actually win games. You might spend it in the wrong way. And on the flip side, many things that companies can do to serve wider society don't actually cost you that much in terms of input. Right? Just to treat my workers better, to provide them with meaningful work and skills development doesn't cost me money, but it can have a huge impact. So I wanted to look at the output, how well a company actually does in treating its stakeholders rather than how much it spends. Now the question is, well, which stakeholders do we look at? Do we look at the environment or communities or employees? I chose to look at employees. Why? For a few reasons. First is employees are material to nearly every company. Right? Every company, human capital is a key asset, whereas climate change is clearly very important, but it's not important in every sector. For example, in the tech sector, climate change is not so critical. The second reason why I chose to focus on employees is I had a very good measure, which is the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, published in Fortune magazine. So why was this list so good? Well, first, it actually surveys the employees to find out how they actually feel, rather than asking the management how much you spend. But the second important thing is this data started in 1984. So why is that so powerful? Well, ESG is a new phenomenon, and many companies have only been, many data sets have only been around, let's say, for the last 10 years. And if I showed you that ESG outperformed between 2010 and 2019, you might say, well, those are 10 boom years for the stock market. Maybe ESG only pays off in an upswing. Maybe right now in a downturn, ESG just doesn't matter. Okay? But because my data started in 1984, I contained things like the financial crisis, like the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could show that it was robust. Now, there's a lot of challenges here. You might think, well, is it correlation or is it causation? Does employee well-being lead to better performance? Or is it once a company is already doing well, can it spend on its employees? So I had to do a lot of work to address those issues. I'm not going to bore you with all of the methodology. I'm going to get to the bottom line because that's what matters to you as practitioners. So what I found was that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered total shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. So that is 89 to 184% cumulative. And it's worth pausing just to highlight the importance of this result. So what this means is that companies that treat their workers well are not just being moral, they're not just being ethical. This is actually just good business, right? They're investing in one of their key assets. And even though that investment does cost money, it pays off much higher dividends in the long term. Long-term shareholder returns are. Okay, so the final part of my talk, my final 10 minutes, let's think about, well, how do we actually put it into practice, right? What I've argued is that some dimensions of purpose do show up in terms of long-term performance. But, well, how do we actually then improve purpose? And let me get to the elephant in the room. And this is one of the things which is massively misunderstood, is what does it actually mean for a company to be purposeful? Now, many people think that purpose is a synonym for altruism. They might say things like the following. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities while generating returns to investors. Now, that sounds great because you're serving everybody, but it's unrealistic. Why? Because there are trade-offs. You can't serve everybody. Well, if you are an energy company and you close down a coal-fired power station, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers, so you can't serve everybody. But indeed, let's think about what the word purpose means. It doesn't mean altruism. It means being focused and targeted. Right? A purposeful meeting is a meeting with a clear agenda. And if I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately and intentionally. So a purposeful company is one that focuses on a couple of issues. Purpose is why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And that might sound pretty lofty, but why I define purpose in this way is that it highlights the importance of being focused and targeted. Just like a person's purpose would never be to be a lawyer and a teacher and a banker and a charity worker, you might focus to be on one of them. So there's two things that I focus on, which helps a company think about its purpose. So why do you exist? Now, I highlight the importance of comparative advantage. You should focus on the issues that you have expertise in solving. So why did Vodafone focus on M-Pesa, not on climate change? Right? Climate change is really important, But Vodafone's expertise is not so much in solutions to climate change. Its expertise was in technology, and therefore it chose to use that technology in order to solve that social problem of financial inclusion in Kenya. Like, focus on a few things, the things that we are best placed to solve. Don't try to be all things to all people. And finally, we have the who. So who do you want to serve? Well, there's all of these different constituencies, but we can't serve everybody. And so this is the importance of materiality, which I alluded to quickly earlier, but I'm now going to revisit. So what does materiality mean? Right, there's different stakeholders that you might care about, but some are more important for your business than others. Now, some of you will be familiar with this. It's the materiality map of the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. And what this does is it goes industry by industry and highlights who are the most material stakeholders for your industry. So let's take the first column, which is mining. Right, and the environment is really important. If you are Rio Tinto and you blow up Juukan Gorge, that's going to be really bad for your business. But in terms of financials, well, the environment isn't so important. Right? If there's a flood, that doesn't really affect banks as much as it might do other industries. But what is really important is social capital. Right? Things like selling practices and product labeling. If you're Wells Fargo and you're in a fake bank account scandal, that's going to be really bad. So why does materiality matter? It matters for the business case. And so take this paper by Khan, Serafim and Yoon. So what they do is they take the MSCI data set on ESG and they look at companies that do well across the board. They do well on all ESG dimensions. And what they found was that those companies outperform by 1.5% per year, which is insignificant. It's actually not significantly different from zero. So the common claim that ESG always pays off, this is not there in the data when you look not at employees, but all forms of ESG. But there is a twist, which is when you redo that with a materiality lens, you look at companies that do well on the material issues, but which scale back on the immaterial ones, they do beat the market by 4.8% per year. And again, let me pause to highlight the significance of the result. But what this suggests is that true purpose is not being about being all things to all people and ticking every single box, but to focus on a couple of really important issues. And so let me just end by just talking about how this applies to the financial crisis, to the coronavirus crisis. Because when the crisis broke out, people thought, oh, well, this will be the end of responsibility. Companies just need to focus on survival. They can't think about purpose. But in fact, what the pandemic has shown is that responsibility is not only feasible, but even more urgent. And let me just talk about a couple of things before opening up to questions. So what we've seen in the pandemic is a number of companies do some amazing actions to split the pie more fair. So some CEOs are working for nothing. Some companies are continuing to pay their workers, even though they're furloughed. And some companies are helping out customers. They're giving away, say Unilever is giving away 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. Now, those are great examples. And any company that does that should be widely praised. But the problem with viewing responsibility as being about splitting the pie is that not every company can split the pie. Like, what if you don't have 100 million euros hanging around? What if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry and you don't have products to give? But this is the power of viewing responsibility as being about growing the pie, actively creating value, because that doesn't actually require a huge amount of money. So what I think a responsible business leader should ask herself is, what is in my hand? Like, what are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has? And how can I use this to serve wider society? And why this is so powerful is that it allows companies, even in unrelated industries, to help out. So let's say take Mercedes, which makes Formula One engines, right? That is useless in a pandemic. But what is in Mercedes' hand is precision engineering expertise, and they use that same precision engineering to make CPAP breathing machines, which are a less invasive alternative to ventilators. Use their expertise to solve the challenge of today. What about, say, large companies hit by the crisis? Let's take Qantas Airways. They would love to keep paying their workers who are furloughed, but they just can't because that would be suicide. Nobody's flying their planes, they don't have money. But what is in their hand is a relationship. And that relationship is with Woolworths. So Woolworths is, in Australia, is a grocery store. It used to be if you bought groceries in Woolworths, you could get some free air miles and Qantas. But what they've done is they've leveraged that relationship to say, if you are furloughed from Qantas, you can get a job at Woolworths. Again, how can we think creatively? And finally, I'm going to end with some small companies. So let me go to a small company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. It's a chain of brutal gyms in the UK and throughout the world, including Europe and the US. People like David Beckham go to this gym. Now, this gym was closed for many, many months because of the pandemic. But what is in their hand is the ability to do fitness classes. And so what it did is it did this for free online throughout the pandemic, which had a huge impact on people self-isolating at home. Now, you might think, well, that's not that great a story, right? A fitness company offering fitness classes. But here's the great thing, right? So what if you are a receptionist at the gym? The gym is closed, so what can you do? Well, what it turns out is many of those receptionists are actors as their main job. But if you're an actor, your income is volatile, so they took this gym job to give them some income stability. Now, if you're an actor, what is in your hand is that you're really funny. Well, how does that help out in a pandemic? Well, what we had was a lot of people self-isolating at home and also with children at home because the schools were shut. And so what they offered was things like free Zoom storytelling sessions to take the load off working parents. Now, this might seem a small thing, but what this highlights is that even if you're a small business, without tons of money to give to charity, you can still play your part in a pandemic by thinking about what is your expertise and how can you use that to serve wider society. Here's something I'm going to shortly go over to Q&A, but just as mentioned, I wrote this book a year ago about the importance of responsibility. And why I wrote this is, I think for too long, people have thought about purpose as having only an ethical case, not a business case. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's only the ethical case, then it will be seen as secondary, particularly when money is tight. But what I wanted to highlight is, even though I'm a professor of finance, an ex-investment banker, there is a strong financial case, and it's not based on wishful thinking, but a lot of rigorous evidence. And what I want to do is to bring that evidence to life for practitioners, not for academics, and think about how to put it into practice. And Layla has really kindly offered to give this book to all of the people attending this conference, which is great, because otherwise you have a 1 or 2 great or 3 great days of a conference, but then when you go back to their jobs, we often forget about responsibility. So hopefully this might be a resource for those of you wanting to put it into practice. Thank you so much again for the attention, and let me hand back to Layla for the Q&A.
Dear Alex, excellent as always. Thank you. This was so enjoyable and the time always passes so fast. Thank you for showing us another point of view. Before I open for Q&A, I just want to comment. Honestly, this is exactly where we have the issues. So keep on arguing that we're just supposed to be responsible but not profitable. Makes no sense, and it kind of doesn't help our case because it just delays the transition that we're supposed to have right now. So thank you for that input. As Alex mentioned, every single participant of the 3 days of the conference is receiving a free copy of the book. Take it home to sit with it with a cup of tea and think on it with our own brain. Let me see the chat first. If we just have a thank you, Professor. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. There must be many comments, additional things that you would like Professor to explain. So please either raise your hand, either put your message in the chat box. I would be very happy to read it out loud. Who wants to go first? Please, Professor Strook.
Yes, go ahead, Rob. Thanks.
All right. Well, Alex, we may go by the first name. So
absolutely, yeah,
absolutely. All right, that's nice. Nice. So thank you very much, for a truly inspiring and aspiring presentation in your lecture. Right. I mean, it does go and should go without saying, right? It's almost impossible to disagree, right, with what you propose, right? And I particularly like what you were mentioning about the inherent trade-off, in terms of how companies can grow the pie, right, versus their sustainability efforts. One question that I would have, right, and it partly relates to my experience in dealing with these things, right. So a few years ago, I remember, we were doing a kind of study, right, to see and to try to determine whether the company reports, right, on the sustainable practices actually reflect what, on the other hand, the massive big data analysis, right, of their behavior actually suggests. We were trying actually to apply a similar technique that, I'm an econometrician and macroeconomist, right? So originally, right? So what we do in macroeconomics, right? In terms of the GDP data. So does it accurately reflect the true distribution of economic activity? And we were trying to do something similar with sustainability-based behavior. And what actually we found is a kind of a huge bipolar distribution. So on precisely what you were saying. So on one hand, you have a set of companies who do enormous things, right? Whose performance is actually even better compared to what their reports on sustainability and sustainability efforts say. And then you have basically a huge gap in between. And on the other hand of the extreme, right, you can find actually companies who do the power washing, in the sustainability reports, right, saying the world is nice, they treat the workers nicely, all the supply chain is fairly compensated. But the data doesn't show this, right? So, because on one hand, and I think this is actually the core of the problem, that on the one hand, we have star performers, right, who are more aware than anyone, right? You're mentioning, of course, also the case of Vodafone, right? And a huge gap in between, and a large pile and a large density of those who simply couldn't care less, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, based on your perspective, based on your experience, how do you think, right, that this gap could be bridged? Is this simply misfortune? Is it fate? Or do you think that some commendable steps could be done to bridge it? And again, thank you very much for your presentation.
I think it's a fantastic question, Rock, and I think this gets to the heart of it. Right? How can you actually measure whether companies are being responsible or just making nice statements? And certainly data is part of this, but I also would like to highlight the limitations of data. So there are many people who believe data is a panacea. They're saying, well, once we have common sustainability metrics and a common framework, then this will be perfectly measurable, and then we'll be able to separate out the good ones from the bad ones. Now, certainly as a finance professor, I believe in the power of data, but data has a huge amount of limitations, right? You can always do the thing of hit the target, but miss the point, right? You can manage to the data metrics without actually caring about sustainability. Like diversity is something which gets a lot of attention now. And clearly as an ethnic minority, I believe in the importance of diversity, but you can have many companies who will just appoint a few token minorities to the board in order to tick the box without actually changing the corporate culture to be one that actually tolerates diversity. So what does this mean? I think it means that we need to be cognizant of the limitations of data. So there are many investors who think, well, let me have a purely data-driven approach to responsibility and try to form some algorithm to assess companies or rely on ESG ratings. Instead, I think we need this boots on the ground aspect of investing, which is often to meet management and understand the qualitative aspects of it. For example, you can just speak to them and ask, well, what are the things that you've actually done in order to improve diversity and inclusion? You might think, well, can we just interview people? Can't people just make up the answers? But this is something I've spoken to a lot of investors about. And just to have questions, it really will highlight, well, which are the ones who actually understand those issues and which are the ones that don't. It's just like, how do we choose who to hire for a company? Like, we could use data, we could use psychometric tests, we could probably get artificial intelligence to go through your LinkedIn profile, but you will still have the interview. Yeah, and yeah, people can lie in an interview, but it is quite easy if you probe to try to figure out, well, who is the actual actually knowing what they're saying and who's making stuff up. And I think that is also the same with companies. So yes, we want the data, but we want the narrative behind the data. If we can talk to the management, ask them, well, can you give examples of decisions that you have taken where you are based on purpose and not profit? Those are ones which are quite discerning. So I think we want the data, but we need to understand there's always going to be certain qualitative aspects of purpose that data is not going to be measuring. And so we want to supplement the data with those issues also.
Thank you, Alex. Excellent answer as always. Since I don't have any pending hands yet, but please, everybody feel free to come forward. I would just like to continue this debate because it's very, very, very important to kind of resolve this issue. So now we have on one side the growing the pie and understanding that ESG efforts, in general, sustainability efforts need to be focused, right? We don't speak a lot about it, and we should, because as you said, there's this danger of trying to do it all and finally not doing anything because of it, and it's happening a lot. Now, what I wanted to relate now to Rox's question and your answer, the new sustainable corporate governance and the related revision of corporate sustainability reporting. In your opinion, what is the golden thing that's lacking right now in the preparation? So we have seen kind of the developments, how they go, in which direction they go. They are trying to embed a one system fits all approach while being aware that we have this qualitative point, right? So they're trying to reconcile the data-driven world with this purpose that still needs to be qualitatively assessed. And at this point, me as a professional in the field, I'm not sure if they hit the right distribution between the two or the relation between the two. What would be your 5 cents on that? That is something that I'm really interested in hearing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I would say that actually people don't fully understand the importance of the qualitative aspects. So everything seems to be going towards more and more metrics. And why might this be? I think partly, sorry to be a little bit cynical, is their self-interest. So the auditing profession has got around, like if you think about the World Economic Forum Sustainability Capitalism Metrics, that was supported by the big four auditors, because if there is now this cottage industry in auditing sustainability metrics, then they're going to be having a lot of business there. Also, it's based on the fact that a lot of people who are now players in the sustainability game don't actually have a lot of experience in sustainability. Right now, it's become a big issue. Everybody is jumping on the bandwagon and are claiming to say stuff about sustainability, and therefore they think, well, as long as we've got data on this, then even though we're a newcomer to this, we can still measure sustainability by looking at the data. Now, one of my other jobs, as you mentioned in the introductions, I serve on the Responsible Investment Committee for Royal London Asset Management. So they've been around for nearly 20 years. They started doing sustainability before it was in fashion. And one of the phrases that my boss, the head of sustainable investing, uses is that you can't make something artisan computational, right? So it's actually an art to figure out, well, what companies are good or bad. Now, if you're a newcomer to the industry and you don't have that artisan approach, yeah, you want to claim that you can reduce it to metrics, because then even a new person can look at this. And that's why we have a lot of claims, well, let's try to tie CEO pay to ESG metrics and so on like that. But I think it's, yes, while data is important, there's so much beyond the data. We know the dangers of a common metric, like quarterly earnings. That is a common metric which is comparable, but people can manage to quarterly earnings. That's true for non-financial measures like standardized test scores. Teachers then teach to the test, and it's the same with sustainability metrics.
Okay, thank you very much. This set is really helpful. I hope that we will kind of we started with reforming the EU system, and I'm grateful that we're going in the direction we're going, but it's kind of taking a little bit too long to come to this qualitative agreement or understanding that qualitative measures are kind of the ones who are going to pave the way of the best practices and not the quantitative. Okay, thank you very much, Alex. This was exceptional. We ran out of time. I wish you a lovely day. And to all the participants, you're going to be receiving, of course, Alex's excellent last book. Thank you very much.